So now we will start section 2 about sign language broadcasting guidelines. In this section, we will talk about the deaf signer's rights to access information. We will talk about the different kinds of accessibility using natural sign languages. And also, we will explain some of the basic technical guidelines for broadcasting sign languages. In the last part of this section, we will talk about best practices when working with media sign language interpreters. The UN Convention of the Right of the Persons with Disabilities, the CRPD, recognizes the right of deaf people to access information using their cultural and linguistic communication system, that is, their own national sign language. So here you find the articles that specifically tackle this topic. You can read through them. If you want, you can have a look at this same text, the UN CRPD, that is interpreted into International Sign System and other sign languages. You can find all the versions on the World Federation of the Deaf website. Maybe some of you are wondering why deaf people need to access information through sign languages. Why captioning or subtitling is not enough to grant accessibility. And the thing is that captions and subtitles, for example, they convey the written text. But for example, they cannot convey intonation, emotion, or other audio information that is relevant to the media. Also, very importantly, deaf users, they have different levels of abilities regarding their second language, which is spoken language, either in speech form or written text. And this is important because subtitling on television, sometimes it has a speed rate that is too fast for the deaf people to access the information through subtitling only. So sign language and sign language interpretation on television provide a richer and more equivalent access for users which use sign language as a primary communication system. So when we talk about accessibility using sign language, we have to bear in mind that there are different sign language services that can be found on television. The first is if the program is sign presented or sign interpreted, and we will talk about this later on in this section. But also if the service is an open service so that everyone, the hearing people and the deaf people, see the interpreter and the sign version on the screen. If it's a closed service, so that people can turn it on when they want to and turn it off if they don't want to see the sign version on screen. And also, if accessibility with sign language can be granted through video on demand. Another difference in the quality of the sign language interpretation is whether the program is live or non-live. So we will talk about different possibilities and best practices, but we have to bear in mind that the services that use sign language may vary greatly in the preparation time, the linguistic content, the speed, and other issues. Another important fact is that even though the UN Convention recognizes the right for deaf people to access information using sign languages, not all the countries have a legal or non-legal text that recognizes this right. And even when this is the case, for example, in Spain, sign language accessibility is still very scarce. For example, the media and broadcasting law in Spain for accessibility for deaf people recognize the right to have the 75% of the programs in subtitling or captioning, but only 2 hours a week of sign interpreted or sign presented content. So, as you see, the difference is very, very big. So before continuing, you will see 2 different news programs that include interpreting, but I want you to pay attention to the different formats that are used in this television. So pay attention to the position of the interpreter, the colors, the size, and also the interaction with other visual content.
평강군 동쪽 17km 지점에서 출발한 것으로 확인됐습니다. 국방부는 특히 파주와 백령도에서 추락한 무인기는 비행 조종 컴퓨터에 입력된 비행 계획과 사진 촬영 경로가 정확히 일치했다고 밝혔습니다.
In central London, meanwhile, remember we've still got works at Victoria. Victoria Street is closed eastbound between Bressenden Place and Palace Street. Time for a look at the weather now. Here's Georgina Burnett.
Good morning. We have a brighter day ahead of us today and some showers too, but certainly not the rain that's been plaguing us over the last couple of days. So first thing...
Okay, as you have seen in these 2 clips, the one from Korea and the one from UK, there is a very wide variety in the ways the interpreter is inserted on screen. The truth is that there is no quality standard or universal guidelines regarding how sign language should be presented and broadcasted. An exception to this is in Ireland, where the National Disability Authority, the NDA, has developed some guidelines for digital TV equipment and services, and they have included some best practices to include sign language interpretation on screen. So I really encourage you to have a look at their website and see what their guidelines are. So this lack of standardization can be seen if you access the online platform Sign Language Television for the Deaf on this website link, where there are screenshots from 42 different countries. Here you just see a selection from Italy, Korea, and South Africa, and you see the wide differences in size, colors, and presentation in general. So what we will do is show you different possibilities of these different formats for inserting sign language on screen, and we will point out which of the practices grant a better accessibility and which may jeopardize accessibility. The truth is that there is little research and guidance available, and this contrasts with the big amount of research that has been carried out for subtitling and AD. And we really hope that research on sign language on TV is developed. The guidelines that we are going to mention in this lesson are adopted and adapted sometimes from the following documents about the signing books guidelines, the web content accessibility guidelines, and the video interpreting best practice. We assume that because sign languages are visual languages and they are used in visual media, similar guidelines and best practices can be used for broadcasting on TV. So here you see the references of these 3 documents, and you can find them later on at the end of the video in the reference section too. First, we will talk about the basic technical guidelines for broadcasting sign languages, and specifically we're going to tackle 3 different aspects. The first one will be about filming the signer, the second one about the screen compositions and how the signer interacts with the rest of the visual information on screen. That can be the main visual information, but also the digital on-screen graphics, the captions, subtitles, and so on. And also about the color contrast. Sign language users always mention the size of the signer on screen and the color contrast being of utmost importance to grant accessibility. But there are other technical aspects that are important too, and that is what we're going to talk about in this section. So, when filming the signer specifically, we have to bear in mind the signing space, the shot, and the eye line. The signing space is the space that is in front of the signer that is used to articulate all the signs. And this is very important because sign language is a three-dimensional language and uses different active articulators such as the hands, the arms, the shoulders, the face, the lips, and the tongue. And all these body articulators should be in the shot all the time. Another important thing is that the signing space may vary from language to language, from signer to signer, or even within different registers. So for example, in this slide, you can see two different representations of the signing space. Sometimes it is conceived as a triangle, sometimes as a bubble with 3 dimensions, or as a frame. So when filming the signer's signing space, it is very important to avoid cuts off. So for example, in this slide, we see a screenshot from a TV program in the Spanish TV where the interpreter's hands are out of the box so that the information that is shown through the hand shape is completely missed out. But also it's important to avoid obstructions. So for example, when different objects might be in front of the signer. So the best practice should be to use a long mid shot with some air above the head and some air on both sides of the signer to allow this natural signing space, and so that the interpreter or the signer is not too tight within the frame. And also a frontal or a semi-profile shot, because that is the way that all the facial expressions can be captured more accurately. And the practices that should be avoided is close-ups or extreme close-ups that would completely cut off the linguistic information, too long shots that would imply that the sign language is too small to be appreciated and distinguished in a natural way, and of course, as we mentioned earlier, cuts off. And now you will see the starting part of an interview that was made to Sean Birdie, a deaf American actor that plays one of the big roles in the Switch at Birth TV series. And at the beginning of the interview, he is complaining that in previous interviews he has been cropped so that only his face was on the screen, so that all the linguistic parts of the sign language were completely missed out.
So, it's got the signing in the picture?
I hope so. It's awesome.
You know, last time I did an interview, somebody cropped me right just in the face. I was very disappointed. But anyhow, hi, how are you?
Hi, good. I'm good. How are you?
Sometimes you will see that some interpreters on TV appear with mid shots rather than long mid shots, as we said would be the best practice. For example, in the Portuguese TV, the interpreter has a very small box so that the professionals ask the cameraman to film them with a shorter shot so that the actual size of the hands and the face on screen can be a bit bigger. Of course, using this shot restricts the signing space, but at least the hand shapes and the facial expressions can be discernible. Otherwise, it would be very difficult to discriminate an interpreter this small with a longer shot. Okay, and the last topic that we will talk about regarding the filming designer section is that the best practice is that the camera is at the eye level so that the designer can engage with the audience. Of course, this also enables a better visibility of the articulators, but it might be the case that in different registers, for example, like kids programs or interviews, maybe this can be changed. But as a general guideline, the best thing would be to have the camera at the eye level. Okay, now we will talk about the screen composition and the interaction with the visuals. Regarding the screen composition and interaction with the visuals, we are going to discuss the designer's presentation on screen, that is, using a picture-in-picture technology or using the chroma key, for example. Designer's position on screen, like right, left, up, central, or bottom. And also the interaction with the visuals, which can be regarded either as positive, neutral, or negative. So when we talk about designers' presentations, there are mainly three different modalities. Designer could be either on the main screen, or it can be added using two different technologies. That is a picture-in-picture technology, and normally we can find different shapes of this box. For example, it can be squared or rectangular, or circular, or even an oval or an egg shape. As we can see, for example, in these pictures below in the Serbian television. Also, chroma key technology can be used, as we can see in the Polish television example. Using the same examples, we can talk about the designer's position on screen. We can differentiate within the left and right positions, and also in the top, central, or bottom position. The most commonly used position is a bottom right position, but no research has been carried out to see if any of these positions facilitates or jeopardizes accessibility using sign language. So normally, this is a choice that is made by broadcasters using design criteria rather than accessibility criteria. Okay, the last characteristic to have in mind when we talk about this screen composition is the designer's presentation. So what is of utmost importance is that the resolution and the size is sufficient to grant accessibility. And as you can see, the size of the interpreter on screen vary greatly from broadcaster to broadcaster. As you can see in the slide, we have included two very different formats to insert the interpreter on screen. We have a chroma key inserted interpreter in the Belgian television with a big size, with a longer shot, and a prominent position on the screen. And to contrast, we have the Korean example with a very small, fairly small interpreter on the bottom part of the screen, sharing this position with some of the digital on-screen graphics. As we will talk later on in this section, this could be regarded as a negative interaction between the interpreter or designer and the visuals on screen. So when we're talking about screen composition and accessibility for deaf people, it's very important to realize that accessing visual media and sign languages is a difficult task because it implies divided attention. So we cannot attend to visual inputs at the same time, and deaf people have to choose what to attend at each moment. So in a typical screen composition for news broadcasting, which is the kind of programs that are normally interpreted and accessible in sign languages in many different broadcasters. What we have is a screen composition with the visual information, the hearing presenter, and the sign language presenter or interpreter. But studies and research using sign language with eye tracking technologies have shown that deaf people do not attend the hearing presenter. Rather, they concentrate their attention on the signer, and they attend sometimes to the main visual information on the screen. So actually, we could think that to grant accessibility or for a better accessibility for deaf people, the presenter, the hearing presenter, could be avoided so that the sign language could have a more prominent position and also, of course, a bigger size in the composition. Now we will continue talking about the interaction between the signer and the visuals. And as we introduced earlier, the interaction between the signer and the visual media can be either positive, neutral, or negative. In the examples that we have here, the UK example is a positive interaction, shows a positive interaction between the signer and the visual. In this case, the interpreter is pointing to the presenter and directing his eye gaze to the presenter so that it uses the visual information to complement his signing. A neutral interaction would mean that there's no actual interaction between the signer and the media. And the examples from Slovenia and Serbia show a negative interaction. In this case, the interpreter is blocking the visual media. In the Slovenia example, the interpreting is blocking the captions, part of the captions. And in the Serbia example, the thing is that the position and size of the interpreter's box blocks a big part, nearly a third, of the visual information. Sometimes the negative interaction is in the opposite direction, as we have seen in the Korean example. That means that sometimes it is other visual information, for example, the digital on-screen graphics, that block or partially block the interpreter's signing, for example, the hand shape or the facial expressions. Okay, and to finish with this section, we are going to talk about the color contrast. Color contrast, together with the size of the signers on screen, has been mentioned to be of utmost importance to grant accessibility of sign language on screen. When we talk about color interactions, we have to bear in mind three different aspects. That is the combination of colors between background color, the clothes color, and the skin color. And this can greatly affect perception, accessibility, or produce eye fatigue to the deaf viewers. And it is very important, or it is even more important when we're talking about deafblind users. That is, deaf users with a low vision or partially sighted. So in this slide, you can see many different examples of color combination. If we have a look at the South African screenshot, we can see that the clothes color does not contrast at all with the skin color of the signer. So it is very difficult to see or differentiate the hand shapes and the facial expression. Something similar can be seen in the Russian example, but in this case it is the background color and the clothes color with very pallid skin color. So in this case, accessibility can be jeopardized because there is not enough contrast between background, clothes, and skin color. In the Croatian and Spanish examples, we do have contrast, color contrast, but the thing is that, for example, in the Croatian example, the too bright color of the clothes of the signer can produce eye fatigue if the video is long enough. And the same could be said about the Spanish example, where the background color, which is patterned and have different colors, could produce eye fatigue too. So we could say that a best practice would be to have like not a pattern background, but rather, or pattern clothes, but rather plain monochromatic colors. For example, in the Estonia screenshot, we can see a good color contrast between background, skin color, and clothes. And the last Spanish example, we see that when we use chroma key technology and there is no background color in the signer's box, there could be the case that in some moments contrast is completely lost. For example, in this case, the interpreter is wearing black clothes, and when we find a black visual input in the media, there is no contrast, and actually the clothes and the body shape of the interpreter is completely lost. We just see like the head and the hands with no frame at all. So now you are able to answer question number 3. So sign language users generally agree that the most important technical features are A, a positive interaction with the visuals and on-screen position, B, on-screen size of the signs and color contrast, or C, the shape of the picture-in-picture, subscreen, and the shot size. And the correct answer is B. For most sign language users, or at least that is what is attested in the literature, the most important technical features to grant accessibility are on-screen size of the signs and the color contrast. So, in the last section of this part of our lesson, we will talk about the best practices for working with sign language media interpreters. And this section has been adapted from the video interpreting best practices developed by Ryan and Skinner in 2015. And you can access the full text on the online version through the web link. Broadcasters should only employ qualified interpreters that have the official qualification from each National Association of Sign Language Interpreters, or that are accredited or registered through their associations. So to know the different assessment and qualification that your national sign language interpreters should have, you can access the WASLI website, that is the World Association of Sign Language Interpreters. If your country is not listed on their website, you can always try to find the National Association of Sign Language Interpreters within your country. So media interpreters work with a varied audience with different linguistic and cultural backgrounds, and also work with an audience that is not present so that they cannot get feedback from their users. So it is very important that broadcasters hire interpreters that are highly experienced, that have worked within a variety, a wide range of different interpreting settings, and that have had exposure to a wide breadth of sign language users, so that they can adjust to a wide range of registers according to the programs and the audiences that they are designed for. Also, media interpreters need to be highly skilled interpreters. They should have native command of the national sign language of the country, And they should also have an updated knowledge of the neologisms and terminology of the current events. Highly skilled interpreters mean they have to be highly skilled not only in their linguistic abilities, but also in their interpreting skills and strategies. So they have to be trained and qualified, as we mentioned, but also suitably trained. That is, they should be familiar with using a teleprompter, for example, signing in front of the camera, or having no feedback because the users are not present during their interpretation. These are some characteristics that novice interpreters might not be familiar with. Another very important feature when we're talking about media interpretation is the service preparation time. So it is of utmost importance that the interpreter has a time to prepare the service before the actual interpreting service, and that this preparation time is given and is accompanied with preparation materials. So for example, audiovisual materials, the script of the program, or the step outline, or the video clips and materials that will be used in the program should be readily available for the interpreter to consult so that the sign can be adjusted to this material. Remember, have in mind that sign language is a visual language, and the interpreter should interact positively with visual media. So having these materials in advance, it is of great importance so that the quality of the service is granted. Another important thing to have in mind is the working patterns of the sign language interpreter. Sign language interpretation is a demanding task, both physically and mentally. So when planning the working patterns, the duration and intensity of work should be taken into account so that, for example, suitable breaks are provided so that the physical and mental well-being of the interpreter is preserved. Under standard working conditions, an interpreter performance is set to degrade after a period of 30 minutes. And have in mind that, for example, interpreting news, which are normally with a high speed, which is a very demanding interpreting task in terms of neologisms, strategies, and different characteristics, is not a standard working condition, but a harder working condition. And it is also important that the working environment of the interpreter is appropriate. First of all, when filming an interpreter or a signer, all broadcasting standards should be met. Especially, it is important the illumination so that the articulators can be clearly seen and there are no shadows or no dark parts, so that the language can be fully appreciated. But also, optimal audio and video equipment should be available for the professional. For example, when appropriate, headsets should be provided, teleprompters or microphones, depending on the interpreting service. And it is also important that the recording is made in a quiet and private location where there's no visual or auditory distractions that can interfere with the interpreter's job. So all these aspects, of course, affect greatly the quality of the service and the accessibility. And in fact, accessibility could be vastly compromised if the technical quality, the linguistic quality, or the information quality is not met. So after this last section, I have another question for you to answer. So media sign language interpreters should be A, young sign language interpreter apprentices, and novice interpreters with a university degree, for example, in media. B, highly skilled and experienced interpreters. Or C, native signers with no specific interpreting training. And in this case, the right answer is B. So all media sign language interpreters should be highly skilled and highly experienced interpreters, as we have explained in this previous section.